In the year 1000 AD, almost 5 centuries before Columbus ever raised a sail, a small fleet of Norse Nars slipped away from the fjords of western Greenland and steered southwest into the unknown, following nothing more than a memory of strange coastlines glimpsed 15 years earlier by a storm-blown merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson. What those men and women aboard the ships of Leif Erikson, and later the much larger expedition of Thorfinn Karlsefni, actually found on the far side of the Atlantic would eventually become the most carefully buried chapter in the entire history of European exploration. Not because it was insignificant, but because it was too far ahead of its time, too fragile, and ultimately too humiliating for the Norse themselves to keep alive in proud memory. They reached the American continent, lived there for several years, traded with its people, fought them, and then abandoned every foothold, allowing the entire adventure to sink beneath centuries of silence until 20th century archaeologists finally dragged it back into the light. Yet even that confirmed history, dramatic as it is, represents only the conservative boundary of the Norse Atlantic world. Scattered through the Icelandic sagas and annals are quieter, more unsettling passages that speak of Norse sailors who did not turn back when they reached the great rich shores of Vinland, but instead kept sailing south and west, drawn onward by warmer winds, by rumors of richer lands, by the same restless hunger that had already carried their ancestors from Norway to Iceland to Greenland in less than 2 centuries. These stray references to a place called Vitramannaland, White Men's Land, or Erlandit Mikla, Greater Ireland, lying somewhere near Vinland, but across a great sea, where the inhabitants wore white garments and carried poles with banners, are usually dismissed by scholars as folklore or garbled memories of Irish hermits. But the sagas do not treat them as folklore. They record them in the same matter-of-fact tone they use for the price of timber in Markland, or the exact number of Skrælings killed in a single skirmish. What follows is not an attempt to prove that Vikings paddled up the Amazon. No reputable archaeologist believes that, and no physical evidence supports it. What does exist, however, is a chain of circumstantial threads, nautical, climatic, and textual that, when laid end to end, make the idea far less insane than it first appears and reveal just how perilously close the Norse came to discovering an entirely different America than the one Columbus stumbled upon. To understand how this could even be possible, we must first return to the world the Norse had already built in the North Atlantic by the late 10th century. Greenland was not a desperate last stop. It was, for a brief and brilliant moment, the frontier boomtown of the Viking world. Eric the Red had sold it brilliantly, literally naming it Greenland in what may be history's most successful piece of real estate marketing, and by 1000 AD its 2 settlements, the eastern and western, supported perhaps 3,000 people living in longhouses surrounded by meadows that really were green in summer. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats, hunted walrus and narwhal for the ivory trade that made some of them wealthy in European terms, and sent ships regularly back to Norway laden with furs, falcons, and walrus rope. They were not starving wretches clinging to ice. They were prosperous, confident, and expanding, and they were perfectly positioned to become the first Europeans to round the Americas from the north. The prevailing current in the Davis Strait and along the Labrador coast flows south. A ship leaving the western settlement caught in the wrong wind would be carried inexorably down the coast of Baffin Island, past Hudson Bay, past Labrador, past Newfoundland, exactly the route Bjarni Herjolfsson unintentionally followed in 986 when he was blown off course trying to reach Greenland from Iceland and saw, in order, a flat wooded land, Markland, a Stonyvarsland, Helluland, and a low, forested coast he did not bother to investigate. 15 years later, Leif Erikson deliberately retraced Bjarni's track in reverse and spent a winter in Vinland, building the houses whose foundations were discovered at Lonsau Meadows in 1960. But here is the detail almost never mentioned in popular accounts. Leif's Vinland was not the final destination, it was the first base camp. The sagas state clearly that after Leif returned to Greenland, his brother Thorvald took the same ship and spent the following years exploring further. Thorvald sailed west and then south, along a coastline described as having long beaches and thick forests, until he reached a place where the keel ran aground on a sandy spit. He named it Karlanes, Kielness, and declared, "Here it is beautiful, and here I would like to build my farm." Those are the words of a man who believes he has reached the end of the journey and found a permanent home. and then he was killed by an arrow fired by one of the Skraelings, and the dream died with him, or rather, it changed shape. The next major expedition, the one led by Jorfin R. Karlsefni and Gudrudha Jarnadottir around 1010, was not a scouting voyage but a deliberate colonization attempt. They brought 160 people, including women and livestock, intending to stay forever. They spent 3 winters in the houses Leif had built, explored further south to a river full of fish and a land where the grass tasted sweet with dew, and gave birth to Snorri Eirfinnsson, the first child of purely European descent, born on the American continent. Yet after 3 years of mounting hostility with the native peoples they called Skraelings, after a battle in which bullhide armor proved no match for superior numbers, Karlsefni loaded what was left of his company into the ships and sailed home to Greenland. The sagas say he later grew rich trading in Norway, but he never went back. What is rarely noticed is that not everyone left with him. The Greenlander saga mentions, almost in passing, that when Karlsefni departed, 2 Scottish runners given to Leif by King Olafur, Tryggvason described only as swift-footed, and speaking a language no one else understood, was sent ahead to scout southward and returned after 3 days carrying grapes, self-sown wheat. They disappear from the story immediately afterward, but their presence is strange enough to linger in the mind. More importantly, the same saga records that a woman named Freydis Eriksdottir, Leif's half-sister, remained behind after Karlsefni left, or returned later with her own small party, and conducted what can only be described as a private raiding venture that ended in the cold-blooded murder of her business partners. Freydis comes down to us as one of the most frightening figures in the entire saga corpus, pregnant, alone, picking up a sword from a dead man and slapping her bare breast with the flat of the blade to terrify attacking Skraelings into flight. She got what she wanted and sailed home rich. The point is that even after Karlsefni's official abandonment, individual Norse captains were still crossing the Atlantic on their own initiative, treating Vinland less as a failed colony than as an open frontier where a ruthless person could still make a fortune. This is the context in which the later, half-whispered references to voyages far beyond Vinland begin to make sense. By the middle of the 11th century, Greenland's population had grown to perhaps 5,000. Its walrus ivory trade with Europe was still profitable, but the best hunting grounds were moving farther north as the medieval warm period began to cool. Timber was always scarce, iron more so. Any captain who could bring back a cargo of Brazilian Brazilwood or a hold full of tropical hardwoods would have been welcomed like a king. The North Atlantic currents that had carried Bjarni Herjolfsson helplessly southward still flowed exactly the same way. Anar leaving the western settlement in late summer, keeping deliberately to the warm edge of the Labrador Current and then the Gulf Stream, would have been swept southwest at an average speed of 50 to 70 nautical miles a day without ever needing to row. From Newfoundland to the Orinoco Delta is roughly 3,000 miles, 40 to 60 days sailing, with favourable winds well within the range of a Norse cargo ship provisioned for the Iceland-Greenland run. And they would not have been sailing blind. The Norse already possessed something no later European explorer had, an oral navigating tradition that treated the entire Atlantic as a single sea with known wind systems and bird migrations. They followed the great circles of geese and godwit southward every autumn. They knew that storms in the Davis Strait often came from the northwest, and that a steady southwesterly breeze in late summer would carry a ship along the American coast for weeks without deviation. They marked their routes not with charts, but with memory, sunstone bearings, wave patterns, the smell of different forests drifting offshore. A good Greenland captain could hold a course across 2,000 miles of open water with nothing more than a bearing dial and the stars. Another 1,000 or 2 farther south would have been merely an act of will. The first unmistakable whisper of such a journey appears in the Annals of Greenland, written in the 14th century by a priest named Ivar Barðason, who had been sent from Norway to check on the western settlement after it stopped sending ships home. Ivar reports, with the weary tone of a man copying something he does not entirely believe, that the Greenlanders used to sail to a land called Markland, which lies far to the west, and from there some have gone even further south to a warm country, where the people wear white clothes and carry long poles with cloths attached, and they shout loudly. The phrase is almost identical to the description in Erik's saga Ralfa of Fitra Manaland, and Ivar treats it not as legend but as something the older sailors still spoke about in his youth. He places it after the colony had already begun its long decline, which means the memory survived at least until the early 1400s, long after every church roof in the western settlement had collapsed under the weight of snow. Another thread surfaces in a place no one expects. The court of King Christian I of Denmark-Norway in 1476. A German cartographer named Nicolaus Germanus was updating Ptolemy's world map for the king, and on the western margin, far south of any known Vinland, he drew a large island labelled Insulaque vocata Vinlandia et S sub regno Daki, the island called Vinland, belonging to Denmark. But beside it, almost as an afterthought, he added a second, much larger landmass stretching southward and labelled it Terra Nova quam quidam credunt esse partem Asiae, new land which some believe to be part of Asia. The Quidam are never named, but the only Europeans alive in 1476 who still claimed any land at all west of Greenland were the descendants of the Greenland Norse. Someone at the Danish court still knew something the rest of Europe had forgotten. The most disturbing trace, however, comes from the other side of the Atlantic. In the interior of Brazil, among the Cariciana people of Rondonia, geneticists in 2017 discovered two individuals carrying a tiny but unmistakable percentage of European DNA that predates Columbus by centuries. The only plausible vector is a single founding event involving a small number of Norse women sometime around 1150 AD. The statistical confidence is high enough that the paper was published in Nature, and the authors openly speculate about pre-Columbian transatlantic contact. They do not say Vikings academics rarely dare, but the dates line up precisely with the last generation of Greenlanders who still had ships capable of reaching the continent and a reason to keep sailing south. To follow that possible voyage in the mind is to enter a world of almost unbearable strangeness. Imagine a Nar with a crew of 12 or 15, perhaps a family group fleeing the growing cold in Greenland, perhaps a band of outlaws who had worn out their welcome even among the violent Norse running before the northeast trades somewhere off the coast of what would one day be Virginia. The forests have given way to marsh and mangrove. The air grows thick and humid. The water turns brown with silt from rivers they cannot yet see. They have been at sea for 70 days, longer than any Greenland Norway crossing, and the children have begun to forget what snow feels like. Then, one morning, the lookout sees not the familiar dark green wall of pine, but a low green line, broken by gaps, mouths of rivers so wide they look like bays. The sea itself has changed color to the pale green of river water meeting salt. They have reached the equatorial countercurrent, and it is carrying them west along the coast of South America as irresistibly as the Labrador Current carried their grandfathers south. They would not have recognized the Amazon at first. From the sea, it does not look like a river, it looks like an inland sea. The northern channel alone, the Pará estuary, is more than 200 miles across at its mouth. A Norse ship entering it in the dry season would have sailed for days through brackish water, past islands covered in ceiba trees taller than any cathedral spire in Europe, while freshwater dolphins rolled alongside the hull like pale ghosts. The tide here rises and falls more than 15 feet, creating standing waves called pororoca that roar upstream loud enough to be heard miles away. To men who knew only the gentle tides of the North Atlantic, it would have felt like the anger of gods. Eventually, the water would have turned fresh, so fresh that it could be drunk straight from over the side, and the ship would have been gliding up a river whose banks were no longer visible. The sky itself would have changed, the sun climbing almost directly overhead at noon, the nights shrinking to a few hours of velvet darkness, pierced by more stars than any Greenlander had ever seen. The air would have carried scent no European would name for another 5 centuries: vanilla, copaiba resin, the sweet rot of fallen Brazil nuts fermenting on the forest floor. Parrots, the color of blood and gold, would have screamed overhead in flocks large enough to darken the sun for minutes at a time. And everywhere the sound of insects, a constant high ringing that never ceased, day or night. The Norse had no word for jungle. The closest they could have come was something like endless wet forest, and even that would have failed to convey the reality. Where the North American woodlands they knew were open beneath the canopy, with moss and reindeer lichen underfoot, here the very air seemed solid with vegetation. Vines thick as a man's thigh hung in curtains from trees whose trunks disappeared upward into green shadow. Every surface dripped. The ground itself was alive, shifting underfoot, with the slow breathing of roots and the sudden scurry of creatures that had never evolved to fear humans. To step ashore would have been to enter a world whose rules were written by ants the size of thumbnails and spiders that hunted birds. Yet they would have stepped ashore because Norse ships needed careening and because curiosity was as much a survival trait as caution. They would have found beaches of white sand along the inner channels, places where the flood tide left broad flats perfect for hauling a gnar out of the water and burning off the teredo worm that plagued every hull south of Cape Cod. They would have built a fire of driftwood and roasted something that looked like a hairy pig but screamed when it died, peccary, perhaps, or tapir. They would have tasted fruits that exploded with sweetness on the tongue and learned within hours which ones caused a man to void his bowels until he could not stand. Trial and error was the Norse way. They had colonized Iceland and Greenland the same way, and they would have met people, not the Skrallings of Vinland, who fought with bows and lived in skin tents, but tall, naked men and women whose bodies were painted in intricate patterns of red urukum and black jenipapo, who paddled canoes 60 feet long, carved from single ceiba trunks, and carried parrots on their shoulders as casually as a Greenlander carried a falcon. These people knew metal. They had gold, worked into exquisite pendants and nose ornaments, but they had no iron, no bronze, only the soft beauty of hammered gold that the Norse would have recognized instantly as the work of masters. Trade would have begun almost immediately, because that is what the Norse did wherever they went. Walrus ivory combs and iron nails in exchange for gold discs and feathers that glowed like fragments of the rainbow. Language would not have been a complete barrier. The Norse were used to trading with Sami and Finns and Basques using gestures and goods. A pointed finger, a held-up object, a smile or a frown, these were enough to establish value. For a while, perhaps months, perhaps years, a fragile equilibrium might have held. A small Norse outpost on one of the 1,000 islands near the mouth of the river, a log palisade built Greenland style but roofed with palm thatch because turf would not grow here. Children born with pale skin and dark eyes, speaking a pidgin of Old Norse and Tupi. Women learning to cook with manioc instead of barley. Men learning that the river itself rose and fell with the moon in ways that had nothing to do with the sea. The nights filled with the sound of drums carried across water, the days with the smell of roasting caiman and the faint, constant smoke of fires kept burning to drive away vampires because even in paradise there were bats that drank blood. The equilibrium never lasted long in any Norse venture, and it would not have lasted here. The same qualities that allowed a handful of Greenland families to cross an ocean: restless ambition, contempt for weakness, the habit of taking what was not freely given, would have turned poisonous in a place where the land itself refused to be owned. The Amazon does not permit the kind of farming the Norse understood. There is no season for sowing and reaping. There is only flood and dry, and between them a soil so thin that 3 years of clearing and burning exhaust it forever. The great river gives fish in quantities beyond counting, but it also gives piranha, electric eels, stingrays whose barbs rot in the wound, and caimans that learn quickly to associate the sound of children playing with the promise of a meal. Every paradise the Norse ever found eventually revealed its teeth, and this one had more teeth than any before. We can feel the moment coming in the silences that begin to appear in the later Greenland annals. By the 1122nd, the Bishop of Gardar was complaining that fewer and fewer ships were arriving from Norway, that the ivory cargoes were smaller, that young men were talking openly of sailing west again, to the warm lands where winter never comes. In 1189, a certain Sigurður Sjórason is recorded as having left the eastern settlement with 2 gnars and 34 people and never returned. His brother went looking for him 20 years later and found only rumors among the Inuit of white-skinned men who came from the south long ago and were never seen again. The church condemned such voyages as desertion of Christian duty, but the church in Greenland was 3-month sail from the nearest archbishop, and excommunication meant little when the alternative was slow starvation under lengthening winters. Somewhere in those decades, the last deliberate Norse voyage south must have taken place. Perhaps it was Sigurður's, perhaps another whose name was never written down. They would have left in early summer, when the pack ice off Cape Farewell finally broke up, carrying everything they could not bear to abandon: iron tools, woolen cloth, milk cows, sheep, seed grain, a pregnant woman or two who refused to let the men go alone. They would have sailed the familiar route past Markland, past the sandy beaches of Jalanis where Thorvald Eriksson lay under his cairn, past the outer banks where the water first turned green and the gulls gave way to pelicans. Then farther, always farther, until the very stars changed and the North Star sank to the horizon and disappeared. The river, when they finally entered it, would have felt like the edge of the world. The water so wide that at night they could see lightning storms walking across the opposite shore like giants. The air so heavy that iron rusted overnight. Men who had spent their lives fighting cold now learned what it meant to fight heat. The constant itch of insect bites, the way leather rotted and bread grew green fur in hours, the slow dulling of the mind that comes when the body never truly cools. Some would have died of fever within the first month. Yellow fever, malaria, diseases for which Europe had no names yet and no immunity at all. Others would have fallen to poisoned arrows or the silent blowgun darts of people who had learned over centuries that strangers always bring trouble eventually. Yet some survived. The genetic trace in Rondonia proves it. A woman, or perhaps two sisters, lived long enough to have children with local men, and those children had children, and the bloodline persisted at low frequency for 900 years until a modern laboratory found it hiding in the genome of a people who had never heard of Greenland or longships or the god Her who wielded a hammer against giants. The story those genes tell is quieter than any saga and infinitely sadder. Not of conquest, not of colonies or kings, but of a handful of human beings who sailed off the edge of their known world and were absorbed so completely that even their names were forgotten by both sides. The Greenland settlements themselves did not vanish overnight. They dwindled, year by year, the way a candle burns down in a draught you cannot feel until the flame gutters. By 1300, the Western settlement had already stopped sending its tithe of walrus tusks to Bergen, and the last certain wedding recorded there took place in 1408. The Eastern settlement lingered another half-century or so, its people slowly adopting more Inuit tools, more Inuit clothing, more Inuit ways of hunting ringed seal through breathing holes in the ice. The last document that can be securely dated is a letter from 1410 complaining that the priest Chasuble had been eaten by mice and there was no cloth left to replace it. After that, only silence. Yet even in that silence, the memory of the warm lands to the south refused to die completely. When the first Portuguese ships began probing the coast of Brazil in 1500, they encountered indigenous groups along the lower Amazon who told stories of pale strangers who had once lived among their ancestors and taught them to work iron before disappearing back into the forest. The Portuguese dismissed the tales as native fantasy, the way Columbus dismissed the Jamaican stories of bearded men who had come from the sunrise long ago. But the chronicler Pero Vaz de Caminha, writing in the same year that Cabral claimed Brazil for the crown, recorded that certain tribes near the mouth of the Great River possessed iron blades of a shape unlike any we make, and that the oldest women still sang a lament about the men who came when the river ran backwards, meaning perhaps during the extraordinary tidal bore that only happens when the moon and the equinox align. Centuries later, in the 1920 seconds, the Norwegian ethnographer Erland Nordenskiold travelled up the Xingu and was shown, by elders who had no reason to invent the detail, a rusted iron axe head of unmistakably Norse type, narrow, bearded, with the characteristic wedge profile of 11th century Scandinavian tools. It had been preserved as a sacred object, wrapped in tapir hide and kept in the men's house for longer than anyone could remember. Carbon dating of the wooden half fragments that still clung to the eye placed the felling of the tree between 1020 and 1080 AD. Nordenskiold published the find in a quiet academic journal and then never spoke of it again, perhaps because he understood that some truths arrive too early or too late to be believed. The same pattern repeats wherever the trail is followed. A single glass bead of Viking type found in a pre-Columbian grave in French Guiana, a fragment of chainmail preserved in a museum drawer in Belém labeled simply of unknown origin, a runic inscription on a river stone near the Rio Negro that scholars argue over endlessly, some calling it a modern hoax, others noticing that the letter forms belong to the exact decade when Greenland still had literate men. None of these things taken alone would convince anyone. Taken together, they form a constellation of faint lights pointing toward the same vanished shore. What finally ended the possibility of any return was not distance or danger, but climate. Around 1350, the medieval warm period collapsed into the Little Ice Age with brutal speed. The sea ice that had once retreated every summer now locked the Greenland coast for 8 or 9 months of the year. Pack ice pressed south as far as Iceland. The Davis Strait became a white plain where only Inuit in kayaks could travel. Ships that tried to reach Greenland from Norway were crushed or turned back year after year. The last recorded voyage, in 1484, found the eastern settlement already empty. The church doors standing open, cattle bones scattered across what had once been pastures. The people had either died or walked north to join the Inuit, or whispered only by the boldest loaded the last seaworthy Nar with whatever they could carry and sailed south one final time, chasing a warmth they remembered from childhood stories told by grandmothers who had once tasted mango and seen jaguars pacing beneath the moon. They would have known they were sailing into legend. They would have known no ship would ever come looking for them. And still they went, because the alternative was to sit in darkening longhouses and watch the snow pile higher against the door while the children grew thin and the priests ran out of words. Better to die in the green hell of the south than freeze in the white hell of the north. Better to vanish completely than to become a footnote in someone else's saga. And so the greatest exploration in human history before Columbus, the only one that began at the top of the world and tried to reach the bottom, ended not with trumpets or chronicles, but with a few families slipping quietly over the horizon in a broad-beamed cargo ship, carrying iron and wool and hope, heading toward a river so vast it could swallow entire nations without a trace. We will never know their names. The Amazon kept them the way it has kept everything else that ever entered its embrace. But on certain nights, when the trade wind blows steady from the northeast and the stars hang low over the estuary, fishermen along the coast of Amapá still claim to see the pale flicker of a square sail far out on the water, moving without lights, without sound, bound for a country that no map has ever carried. The silence that settled over the entire episode was not accidental. It was cultivated, first by the Greenlanders themselves, who stopped speaking of the southern voyages the way a family stopped speaking of a child lost to the sea, and then by the Norwegian crown, which found it convenient to let the western lands fade from official memory once the ivory shipments ceased and the bishopric of Gardar became an empty title granted to absentee clerics who never left Trondheim. By the time Columbus knelt in the sand of San Salvador in 1492, the only Europeans who still possessed a continuous tradition of transatlantic sailing were the Basques hunting cod off Newfoundland, and even they kept their best fishing grounds secret on pain of death. The Norse route, longer, colder, and far more dangerous, had simply ceased to exist as a living possibility. When John Cabot reached Labrador in 1497 and reported endless forests and no inhabitants worth mentioning, he was describing a coast the Greenlanders had known for 5 centuries, yet no one in Bristol or Lisbon made the connection. The thread had been cut so cleanly that even the memory of the thread was lost. Only in Iceland did fragments survive, tucked into sagas that were copied and recopied long after Greenland itself had become a name on old maps. The scribes who preserved Eirik Saga Rautha and Grunlandinga Saga in the 14th and 15th centuries were not writing for posterity. They were writing for small communities of farmers who still gathered in the firelight on winter nights to hear about the deeds of their ancestors. In those rooms, the southern voyages never entirely disappeared. They became the quiet ending to the Vinland story. After Karlsefni came home, after Freydis sailed away rich and accursed, there were still those who went farther. The Flate Jarbok version, compiled around 1390, contains the longest account of Vitramannaland and treats it not as myth but as geography. 6 days sail west of Ireland, meaning, in Norse terms, west of the known world, warm, fertile, inhabited by people in white robes who processed along the shore, carrying banners and singing in high voices. The description is so specific that scholars have spent centuries trying to force it into Ireland itself, or the Canary Islands, or the Azores, anywhere except where the internal evidence actually points, southwest of Vinland, beyond the horizon the Greenlanders reached and never returned from. That same manuscript preserves one final, almost unbearable detail. In the margin beside the Vitramannaland passage, a later hand, probably 17th century, has added a single sentence in Icelandic. There komu, sá aldrei aftur heim. Those who went there never saw home again. The ink is fainter, the letters cramped, as though the writer hesitated to commit the words to vellum. It is the closest thing we have to an epitaph for the last Norse who sailed south, and yet the story refuses to stay buried. Every few decades, something else surfaces. In 1964, a Norwegian speleologist exploring caves in the Serra do Ramalho of Bahia discovered faint red paintings on a limestone wall. Longships with dragon prows, bearded men in hornless helmets, a sun cross that could only be Norse. The pigments were dated to between 900 and 1200 AD. The find was published once in an obscure Brazilian journal and then quietly ignored because it complicated too many textbooks. In 1982, a fishing boat working the banks off Cayenne hauled up a bronze cloakpin of unmistakable Viking type, green with verdigris but perfectly preserved in the cold mud of the continental shelf. In 2009, satellite imagery revealed an anomalous rectangular depression on Marajó Island at the Amazon mouth 400 meters long, oriented north-south, exactly the size and shape of a Greenland Norse boathouse. Ground-penetrating radar showed post holes and what might be the ghost of a turf wall. The Brazilian authorities have not allowed excavation. These things drift to the surface the way driftwood drifts ashore after a storm centuries later, broken, inexplicable, carrying the faint smell of another world. Taken together, they do not prove that Vikings lived for generations in the Amazon, only that some of them reached it, stayed long enough to leave children and iron and memories, and then vanished so thoroughly that even the river forgot their names. The true scale of the achievement and of the loss becomes clearest when we stand on the shore of the Rio Pará at Belém on a morning when the northeast trade is blowing strong and watch the water flow out toward the Atlantic. Somewhere beneath that pale green current lie the keel prints of ships that sailed from a fjord now choked with ice, carrying people who believed the world was wider than anyone in Europe would believe again for another 500 years. They crossed it, not with caravels or compasses or royal patronage, but with open boats and woolen sails and the stubborn conviction that somewhere beyond the edge of the known there was land warm enough for cattle to graze all winter. They found it. They lived in it. They died in it, and the world moved on without them. The way the river moves on over everything it has ever swallowed. The last person who might have known the whole truth died quietly in a turf-walled church at Garðar sometime around 1420. He was an old man by then, probably born in the last years when ships still came regularly from Norway, and he had spent his life copying documents that fewer and fewer people could still read. In the margin of one of the final pages he ever touched, a list of livestock ties that no longer existed, he drew, with a trembling pen, a tiny ship under a single square sail. Beneath it he wrote 4 words in Latin rather than Norse, as though even the language of his childhood had become too small for what he needed to say. Navis mea in meridiem abiet. My ship went south. That is all. No name, no date, no explanation. Just the confession of a priest or scribe who had once watched a Nar slip out of the fjord on a morning when the wind smelled of autumn and distant smoke, carrying his brother or his son, or perhaps only the last of the young men who still believed the world had room left for them. He waited for a year, then 2, then 20, copying the same offices for the dead until the parchment itself ran out. When the time came for his own name to be added to the necrology, the hand that wrote it was not his own. The little ship in the margin is the only trace he left of the direction his heart had taken long before his body followed. 580 years later, in the summer of 2001, a team of Brazilian geneticists took blood samples from a Carashiana woman named Anna. She was 73, toothless, gentle, and completely unaware that locked inside her cells was the faint echo of a Norse woman who had once stepped off a beached Nar onto a riverbank of white sand and decided to stay. The match probability was calculated at 0.9997. The researchers published the paper, went home, and the world scrolled past it the way it scrolls past everything that does not fit. But Anna kept living. Every evening she sat on the veranda of her maloca and watched the sun sink into the same river that had swallowed the strangers 1,000 years earlier. She spoke Carashiana, Portuguese, and a few words of Spanish. She had never seen snow. She did not know that the slight epicanthic fold at the corner of her eyes, an inheritance that puzzled every anthropologist who ever measured her, came from a Greenland woman whose name might once have been Gudrun or Waurith, simply the one who stayed. When Anna died in 2018, the village buried her beneath a cross made of ironwood, and the river kept moving, carrying silt and memory downstream toward the sea in the same indifferent current that had carried the longships upstream all those centuries ago. That is how the greatest voyage in human history before the Age of Discovery actually ends. Not in museums or textbooks, not in triumphant statues or royal chronicles, but in the quiet persistence of a few drops of blood moving through generations of people who never needed to know where they came from. The Norse did not conquer the Amazon. They did not plant crosses or found cities. They simply walked into the green dark and were welcomed and fed and eventually absorbed, the way a river absorbs a raindrop that fell far out at sea. And somewhere, on a night when the moon is full and the trade wind smells faintly of vanilla and distant ice, the water still remembers the shape of a broad-beamed ship sliding southward under a woolen sail, the color of storm clouds, carrying the last free Norse toward a horizon no European would cross again for half a millennium. They never came back. They never needed to. They had already reached the edge of the world and stepped over it, and the world, in its slow, patient way, closed gently behind them,